Hello to everyone and welcome to our Cape Con panel discussion, Not Lost in Translation, How Comics Create Cultural Connections. My name is Krista Danis and I'm the Events and Program Coordinator at the Aurora Public Library. Thank you to our panelists for being here and making this event possible. And thank you to the audience for tuning in on Zoom and on Facebook Live. So before we begin, I do want to let you know about a couple of important initiatives at the library. As you may or may not know, Study Circles is starting up again in late September. Study Circles is a community dialogue initiative around racism and social justice. If you are interested in participating, please check out Study Circles webpage at studycirclesaurora.org. Also, our next panel discussion will be on Saturday, September 19th, entitled Youth, Race, and Activism, in which we will hear from young people in our area about their anti-racist efforts and perspectives on the current climate of racial injustice. So I will be kicking off our event today with an introduction to our amazing panel of artists, illustrators, and authors, after which each panelist will have an opportunity to speak independently to the topic of comics, identity, and how they merge to create cultural connections. The individual presentations will be followed by moderator questions and closing with questions from the audience. So if you have any questions during the presentation, you can submit them directly on Zoom via the Q&A function, or if you're tuning in on Facebook Live, you can use the comments for this event, and we will do our best to answer them all today at the end. So thank you to my colleague Sophie for monitoring Facebook and to our communications director Miriam for working tirelessly to make sure we could go live today. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Jiba Malay Anderson is the owner of Grio Enterprises and creator of the Horsemen graphic novel series and maintains the Afro Soul Chronicles, a blog dedicated to the discussion of race, politics, and the business of popular culture. Anderson is currently a part-time lecturer at Chicago State University, teaching courses in animation, multimedia, and video game design, and speaks across the country promoting comic books and graphic novels as tools for education in the exploration of race, culture, and identity. Welcome, Jiba.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Lila Quintero Weaver is a native of Argentina and a longtime resident of Alabama. She's the writer and illustrator of a graphic memoir, Dark Room, a memoir in black and white, and later served as co-translator of its Spanish edition. As a graphic novelist and documentarian of the immigrant experience in the American South, Lila has lectured at college campuses and across the United States, including Marshall University, Vanderbilt University, and New College of Florida. She has exhibited selections of original art from Darkroom at Whitman College, the University of Richmond, Levine Museum of the New South, and the Ohio State University's Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, and the Rosa Parks Museum. In 2018, she published My Year in the Middle, her first children's novel. So thank you so much for being here, Lila.
Happy to be.
All right. And our next, sorry, I'm reading. Okay, and last but not least, Laura Reyes is an Mexican-American illustrator living here in Aurora. Her artwork focuses on storytelling, illustrations, and comics. She is inspired by everyday life, nature, her friends, and her family. She's a part of Art Bar Collective here in Aurora and has done work for the city of Aurora. She's currently working as an artist and writer on a comic titled Book of Witches, a story about 3 witches becoming friends and solving a mystery together. When she's not drawing, she enjoys a warm cup of coffee, video games, and wishing she had a cat. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Hello.
Yeah, all right. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. And I think I'm gonna start with Lila, and then we'll move on to Jiba, and then follow up at the end with Laura. You wanna take it away?
Okay, excellent. All right, I'm going to start sharing screen. Hope everything goes as it should. And let's see if you could confirm that you see the screen.
We do.
Okay, very well. All right, you're looking at the cover of my memoir. And what's it about? It's basically the story of my family's immigration to the U.S. In 1961. I was a 5-year-old and we settled in the South. So that's a story in itself that I won't spend too much time or really any time on as to why we came to Alabama. But suffice it to say that we arrived just in time to be eyewitnesses to a decade of great consequence in Alabama. Okay, let's see. My next slide. All right. Can you still see that? My controls are a little wonky here. So, all right, we are looking at a page that kind of just is typical of many of the pages in my novel. I constructed it as what I call digital collage that kind of imitates a photo album or a scrapbook, because it takes a lot of the visuals, take their cues from photography. My father was he was a teacher by profession, but he did photography on the side, and I have an enormous collection of family photos. So that was kind of a touchstone inspiration for my work. All right. I set foot on U.S. soil for the first time in March the 28th, 1961, when we arrived to the Miami airport. And all right, let's see. And here is where we came. We settled in Alabama, in the region that is known as the Black Belt region, due to the very rich, dark soil that you see here in this swath of 19 counties that were known for the cotton growing plantations that were there. So, of course, as was true for all of this antebellum period, they used enslaved people for their labor. And to this date, this part of Alabama has the highest percentage of African-American residents than the entire state of Alabama, which is 27% for the state of Alabama, but in this area is anywhere from 60 to 80%, from county to county. So this is where I grew up, in this small town where we were the only Latinos, and where we had, really, there were no other immigrants either to speak of. So we, as I say here, that we introduced a sliver of gray into the demographic pie. Okay. I didn't know what was going on. I was only 5, but imagine this. In 1961, we arrived just in time for the freedom riders who were passing through the South, protesting the Jim Crow laws that were in effect at that time. And I dimly remember seeing the whites only signs, even when I had just barely begun to read, that they were still up. So 1964 is when a lot of the laws, the civil rights laws that gave public access to everyone, then these things came down and changes began to happen. But in the meantime, I had witnessed quite a few things that is hard for me to believe now, that I saw this with my own eyes, that we went to the doctor's office and I saw that there was a separate waiting room for Black patients. And we went to the movie theater, and there was a balcony where the patrons, Black patrons, sat. And even so those are things that were governed by segregation laws at that time, but even in the unwritten laws of society, that I could see that a Black person was supposed to go to the white person's back door, that a Black person riding in a white person's car was supposed to sit in the back seat. And all of these things that I was struggling to understand as a really young kid, that I witnessed at that time, and that I could not understand why it was so widely accepted and just that white people acted as if this was absolutely normal. So, pardon the pause between the slides. Well, I won't explain why, but it's a little bit, I'm having to access it from Dropbox. So in 1965, what began to happen across this Black Belt region is that there was the organized drive by the SCLC and other organizations to try to get Black citizens registered for the vote. And so this began to show up in my small hometown, which is only 27 miles from from Selma. And so everyone knows about Selma, but Marion, Alabama, where I grew up and where I attended elementary school and where I was witness to the daytime marches that were occurring as people tried to register to vote but were turned away at the courthouse with all kinds of flimsy excuses. So in my novel, I go into this a pretty good bit, but what I want to show you is a key event that occurred in my little town that really was a trigger to something far more momentous that I didn't realize the connection until I was, gosh, like 45 years old. So here you see, first of all, you see a page from the book. It's the drawing, and then I have put together contemporary photos of the corresponding places that you see in this kind of bird's eye view. So that antebellum building, that is the county courthouse for Perry County. And then across the street from it is the Methodist Church that was the headquarters for the organizers of the protest marches that were occurring as people tried to register to vote, and then they would march around and around the courthouse square each day for many days in a row in January and February of 1965. Then at the bottom of the screen, you see the house that my family lived in. We were just one block from where all of this happened. And so my dad, who was teaching college classes, would somehow slip in between classes and stand on that corner there, and he took home movies of some of these marches. So that's part of the reason that it stayed in my mind, but kind of vaguely for many years when we would watch those home movies, and that I vaguely wondered what was the actual issue? Why were they marching? And I didn't really know. And I'll get into that just a little bit in just a minute. But so what happened in Marion was that at that street corner where I showed you just a minute ago, that there was a rally at night. And as the protesters came out of the church with candlelight, with candles, to go do a nighttime protest, that they were attacked by a white mob. And there was law enforcement there, and they stood by and did nothing or even participated in the violence. A young man, a young Black protester was shot by a state trooper. His name was Jimmy Lee Jackson, and he's considered one of the martyrs of the civil rights movement. And it was Jimmy Lee Jackson's death which directly led to the march that took place just a few weeks later, the first attempt for the protesters to march from Selma to Montgomery. And if you know a little bit about this history, it's probably refreshed in your mind because Congressman John Lewis was at the head of the line when the march began on one side of this infamous bridge, Edmund Pettus Bridge, and then when they crossed over to the other side, they were attacked by the state troopers waiting for them. So I grew up in this town of Marion and right so close to Selma, and nobody ever put together the pieces for me and helped me to understand that it was the death of this young man that had that triggered the Selma March, that triggered the things that came about after that. So this is at the heart of my book. So many people ask me, well, you were Latinos, you were the only Hispanics in this region. You were one of the few immigrants there. What about what about the racial prejudice or anything like that directed toward you? And this plays a very minimal role in my story because as Latinos, of course, we were not on the inside of society. We were not esteemed, or we could not easily gain entry into society. But I saw with my own eyes, I saw this overt racism. I saw this appalling form of discrimination and brutality that I grew up feeling like, no, I didn't experience discrimination. I didn't experience racism because in my mind, that was the standard of racism. So I still have kind of difficulty sort of putting all that to bed as far as my own experience is concerned because of that comparison that still sits in my mind of what I saw over that decade. And not just the overt violence, not just the obvious racism, but many other shades as you go all the way down to microaggressions. So all right, so let me take a look at then the next slide, which is a little bit about the education that I received, or maybe I should say the miseducation that I received. This is the textbook that was used in public schools at that time, and the textbook I had when I was in the 4th grade. This is how I was taught Alabama history. And so what I did in darkroom, I found a copy of this book in my public library decades and decades later, and it was, of course, not being used anymore, but thankfully the library had preserved a copy of it. And I wanted to show my readers, I wanted to give them a glimpse of of the type of education that we were given at that time. So what I did was I took some of the actual text from this book and put my illustrations with it. So that'll be the next slide I'll show you. So so all these words that you see, now we have come to the happiest way of life in Alabama before the war between the states. And what follows is like a story of children who are, who live in a plantation and their father is the master of the plantation, and how the boy goes out with his father to look at the people working in the cotton fields and all of that. It's just an appalling and unbelievable depiction of forced labor. And I just can't, it's really, I need to make no further comment. Recently, there was an episode of John Oliver on his show on HBO. And there was a woman who actually talked about this textbook, No Alabama. So, and I also have an excerpt from another chapter that's about Reconstruction, and it's, it's even worse than this. But so that's a quick look at some of the content that I have, sort of the concentration of the themes relating to race, but I also do have a little bit, and I'll just show you quickly. I don't want to take too much time, that some of my struggles were different. They had to do with learning English, and then eventually, as many immigrant children do, rejecting my native language. And so here you see sort of my symbolic representation of a little Spanish comic book that my aunts from Argentina had sent us. And that by and by, as English became more and more comfortable to me, that I was, no longer willing to participate in Spanish speaking. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm still on. Something happened. Did I lose?
Yeah, you're still
on. Still on? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just hold it right there to make sure that there's enough time. I have more slides, but I don't want to take too much time. So that gives you a sense of the broad sweep of the material that I cover in Darkroom, which was, I would say, this is kind of the final thing I'll say, is that I learned so much from researching the book, because not only was there that miseducation that I had when I was going through the public school system in Alabama, but also just even in the culture, just the long years of silence where no one addressed what happened during that period, where I had basically no access to information. Why was that young man shot? You know, what happened to him? All of that. That these little bits and pieces kind of slowly came to me. And then as I researched Darkroom, I was able to discover more and more. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen now. And
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leela. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next one is Shiva.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi. So that's a tough act to follow. Beautiful work, by the way, and like amazing work. Like, love it. So I'm coming from a little bit of a different angle. Before I get into what I'm about, well, actually, this is how I'm going to get into a little bit of what I'm about and what I do. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit more. So I had to create this piece, or I created this piece for the Detroit Electronic Music Conference, which is actually ending today through Charivari. And they asked me to create a piece. They asked me to, just do a video of you live, drawing and live streaming it for the festival, and that'll be good enough. I'm a Leo, and my birthday's on Monday, and if you know how Leos get down, we just don't do things simply. So with this is a little video that I put together, which is the Grio mission statement, and also a brief explanation of what I do and why I do it. As it's firing up. Here we go. And see, again, computer screens and having everything work. We're seeing the screen, guys. There we go.
I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. My mother is from Liberia, my father is from the States. I grew up with the U.S. outside my window and Africa behind closed doors. I grew up with the traditions, the food, the music, the art, the strength, and power of the Bai people. I possess the endurance, tenacity, passion, creativity, and drive of being Black in America. I was Afrofuturism before the term even existed. I tap into our folklore and history to give my characters depth and substance. I am in the business of creating mythology. My mentors were revolutionaries. They gave my work purpose. I stand on the shoulders of giants. They help me reach the sky. I use my platform, my culture, and my voice to inform my craft. Everything I make is protest art. My comics are hood. My comics are conscious. My comics are dangerous and gullible. My comics have rhythm. My comics have rhyme. And my comics endure. I am not alone in this. I am one of many. Voices have become a choir, and our song is being heard across the world. We will not be silenced. We were a village, we have become a nation. Celebrate us.
So yeah. So this was a little ad that I had put together for the conference. And I thought that it would be a great introduction into what I do. So I am the product of biculture, bicultural nature. My mother is from West Africa. My father is from the United States. And I did grow up in this environment, which is actually, in the 70s, which is post, civil rights movement, beginning of the Black Power movement, also, the beginnings of, or the real, shall we say, practice of Pan-Africanism, you could say I'm a product of Pan-Africanism, if you will. And so in my life growing up in Detroit, having this sort of bicultural nature, this understanding of my roots, as an African and also as an American, and also, excuse me, being born into a family of creatives and artists and things like that, I was lucky enough to be in this environment where my creativity was fostered. At the same time, as I got older and, and again with my root life, seeing this sort of like, I won't call it a bubble because it's not a bubble. The reality is definitely out there. But I would say the benefit of being a child of the 70s and a child growing up in Detroit is seeing the economic strata, or the caste system, upper, lower, middle class, and them looking like me, right? And having that sort of fortification and respect helped me on my path as a creator. When I became 13, or when I turned 13, before I went into college, I learned how to paint fresco, a dead art, if you will. I learned how to paint fresco from an artist by the name of Steve Davis, may he rest in peace, who was a radical socialist Jew who painted with Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. And one of the things that he told me in my work, he was like, you should have your work. Your work needs to have purpose. You know what I mean? He's like, why aren't you creating work, talking about your people and, you know what I mean, and the struggle and celebrating them and so on and so forth. And so this person like helped put me on the path to like further explore my culture and getting into various things from political and socioeconomic situations to beginning to explore what would be called Afrofuturism. As I said before, I was looking at like African mythology and also having like this African history in my wheelhouse, in my home. Like I didn't have to search for it. I had these books. So I, in my home, in my basement, that I could read and explore this. And it really set me on the path to eventually create what would become Grio Enterprises, my comic book company. Now, I'm best known, as we see, for my book, The Horsemen. And I'm clicking onto the page right now. And The Horsemen is the story of the gods of Africa returning to Earth and possessing 7 people to save humanity from itself. You don't get really any more Afrofuturistic than that. And in this book and in the story, I've used it to not only do some like cool superhero type of stuff as well, but really this is also an exploration into faith systems, into African mythology and world mythology, and taking all of those bits and pieces to create my universe, which is the new mythology, which is based in spirituality, which also is extremely inclusive, because in my world of the Horsemen, I wanted the Horsemen to reflect the real world, you know, and it's through a lens of an African and African American male, and the root of it is you know, African mythology, specifically the Orishas of Nigeria and the Ife faith. But in this world, it doesn't work if I don't respect all of the other mythologies. So that has allowed and helped me to sort of incorporate many different cultures through mythology, through the storytelling, if you will, right? And finding those commonalities and embracing those differences. And in that, it's still very political. It's still very, in some ways, still very radical to have this sort of mindset and have it be a genuine mindset. You know, still the whole thing about diversity. People are still talking about, like, why do things have to be diverse? Because the world is diverse, right? Because the world is various shades of brown. You know what I mean? And the people who claim they are the majority are really the minority in the situation. And part and parcel, the reason why they are the minority in the situation is because of what I like to call the pathology that was set. It's a very exclusionary pathology. I'm speaking in code, but you kind of get what I'm talking about, if you will. So the world of the Horsemen reflects actually the world around us. And what's really interesting is that in these times right now, seeing how elements of my book have come to the fore. You know, seeing that right now, like, as things happen for a hot moment, I'm thinking to myself, gosh, I kind of wrote about this stuff already, and it's coming in real time. So that is what I'm best known for. I actually got started, my first comic book work was a radical work, which is being re-released right now, JBD, The Devil's Due. As we see in the beginning, what's fascinating about that is I first worked on this book in 1996, and this is the book right here, even in 2020, it is still uncomfortable, triggering, and radical because of the imagery, of course, and the creator of the book, Lamoris Richmond, and when I came on board, what we were doing is we're taking this imagery and we're turning it on its ear, okay? This is not glorifying it. We're using the techniques much that NWA used in taking that word and turning it into a word of empowerment, although we're definitely making the word jigaboo an empowering word. What we're doing is we're taking that imagery that was meant to denigrate, that for decades was used to describe us visually, which is still kind of poisonous, and even to this day that imagery still comes to the fore. Like, for example, when people saw this imagery, immediately the thing that they thought of was the character Mr. Popo on Dragon Ball Z. And some people wanted to say, oh, that's a copyright infringement on Mr. Popo. And I had to explain to them, it's like, no, what Mr. Popo represents is the Sambo image, which was a negative image that depicted what Black people looked like from the turn of the century and from the minstrel shows on. So you still have this imagery still to the fore, and you have these people coming in and looking at this imagery, and they're like, oh, that's a beloved character from this anime that I really like. And then when I tell them, like, no, that imagery of that character is based on racist tropes that depict Black people, then they're like, no, that's not true. Yes, it is. Right? So as I said, my work covers the spectrum of it. So on one hand, with JBD is the radical, angry, right, reactionary Black nationalist rage that we feel, right? I mean, it's still happening today. The sad thing, the unfortunate thing is what Lila described, or excuse me, Lila, what she described in her book, it's still happening today, August 15th, 2020, right? And we have to have these type of works to talk about that, because they don't become irrelevant until those situations change. So with JBD, you know, there's the anger. And then with the Horsemen, the Afrofuturistic book that I do, there's the hope. You see what I mean? So that's my work in a nutshell. And this is where I take my stance on, you know, on society, is through comics. So as I said before in the video, everything I make is protest art, right? So thank you for that. I guess I'm gonna pass the mic on to our next panelist.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Shiva. That was awesome. I'm just itching for these moderator questions in the conversation. And then, yeah, so Laura, let's move on to Laura.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura, and first of all, let me just start saying, like, I'm really honored to be a part of this panel with these two really great artists and authors. And I'm gonna share the screen here. So as Krista said, I'm Aurora native. Like, I lived here my whole life so far. And I'm an illustrator, and my main focus is creating stories in my illustrations and my comics. And I'm working on a children's book right now for a client, and it's really cute so far. And my comic book called Book of Witches, and that's about 3 friends who there's a mystery of like missing witches going on their town. So they team up together to solve that mystery. And then, so I'm gonna be discussing my cultural background and how my languages have influenced my work and my comics. So first, how did I start drawing? I think like many other artists would say, we've been drawing for a long time. Since as I was a kid, I would create stories with the toys that I had, and then I would draw out those stories in like comics. And then, so as a kid, I realized the power of communication that all these images held. And then as for my cultural background, my parents immigrated from Mexico to the United States. So as a kid, Spanish was our primary language. It's what I've heard at home, and like what my whole family speaks in, and like all my tias and tios and everyone communicates in. So what happened is, like Lila described too in her book, so me and my brother we started going to school, and everything was in English. So that's when English became the primary way I was learning and communicating. So like the books, the teacher's lessons were in English, the signs on the bathrooms. It was how I communicated with my friends and my teachers. It was how I like read everything, like all the stories, how I wrote like all my assignments. It's just like a huge jump. So eventually I felt that my English was better than my Spanish. And slowly over time, I reduced like the amount that I spoke. So even with my parents, like they would talk to me in Spanish and then I would respond in English to them and we would understand each other fine. But so yeah, I found myself dedicating like all my effort in like English classes, like writing essays and doing like, you know, those big analyzing like five-page essays. Like I got really into that. And then so despite this, you could say I'm not the most confident speaker, but so here I am like in my English class, like thinking I was like really cool at English. And so we had a debate in one English class and I felt that I did my section pretty well. And afterwards, I'm sure the teacher meant no harm, but they just commented that I had a heavy accent. And I was taken back for a bit because I was like, wow, did I always sound this way? Or was it like, was I just not accepting that I sounded this way? Like, you know, just all those questions were like in my head. And then later after high school, I got a job at a call center. And especially there, the customers did not hold back at all. So I got, sorry. So I got like so much criticism, like they wouldn't believe that we were based in America, like, or some rudely questioned me if I was even attending school. There's a lot of stories there, but that's for another time. And then, so I felt like I was in a conflicted spot. Like I had an accent from a language that I felt that I wasn't well versed in, but I can communicate in Spanish fine and I understand when someone speaks it to me. So this just made me question, like, was it just me living here that I felt that I had to focus on English more? And then back with my family, like everyone's talking in Spanish and I would absorb and listen fine. And they talk about their stories and their chismes. And so I would listen, but I really wish that I could say like much more eloquent phrases when I would speak with them, because I really felt like my language, my vocabulary was limited in Spanish. So it really felt like, okay. It really felt like I was someone that was like split in two. Like there's a saying that that we say a lot in my family, like ni somos de aquí ni de allá. So that basically means like we don't feel like immigrants that immigrated here don't feel that they're not from their home country anymore, but they're also, they can't really be from here, if that makes sense. So all of this, I realized like I didn't want to lose this part of my cultural self. All this made me realize and wonder like why have I been pushing Spanish back? So I dedicated more time into reading and learning about my background. I started asking my mom more about my family, like my grandpa worked in the Bracero program in the United States, which I think was in the 1960s, around there, and how my parents' childhood was in Mexico. And of course, listening to those countless stories and chismes when we would get together in holidays and reunions. So it's these stories are what make up my family and I. And it's these stories that I've really come to cherish. So when I was creating the comic with my friends, I really wanted to bring some of that story into our comic. So this is the comic, the cover. And art is a wonderful thing because as a kid, I knew how art allowed me to express myself. And I realized that's why art has been with me so long, because it's really a way to share my identities and feelings. It's a way to connect to others. Like even knowing two languages, sometimes it's still hard to find the right words to say or describe something. but through arts and comics, I can share stories that reflect myself and be able to communicate with others that might have been able to reach before. So here's some panels in the inside. So the comic has allowed me to connect with others via the story. And when my friends and I were creating it, we wanted to create main characters who are like ourselves. And we wanted to capture experiences that we shared. So here in the middle, there's like the main characters are talking to their parents in both English and Spanish, because that's something that we've done. And the bottom left is, that's an example of one of the spells. So the spells are written in Spanish first, and then we mix the arrangement of the letters. So it looks funky and magical, but ultimately the foundation is Spanish. And the top left is a character, one of the characters' mom, and she's wearing a shirt that's inspired by the embroidery, if I can say that, that's done like in Mexico. So I wanted it to feel like maybe the mom went on a family trip and she came back and brought that with her and she's just wearing it. So I think it's important to have representation that spans across different genres. Like magic is a fantasy genre, but it's important at the same time to acknowledge the little details that I have, like the everyday life that we've experienced as growing up as children of immigrants. As the comic continues, my hope is that more readers find themselves enjoying the story and connecting to the characters. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity that the comic has given me to connect to others, especially the children that have taken an interest to it. And they're all very sweet about it. Like this drawing's a drawing of some Facebook comments that I've received. And like every time someone comments, I'm just like, oh, I get like so motivated again. So all the kids are all very sweet about it. So ultimately what I want to say is like comics are something that we as authors and artists, we put a lot of time into them. They take a good long amount of time. So many thumbnailing, inking, coloring, writing. So we give a lot to the readers, but at the same time, the readers are the ones who also give us a lot in return. So yeah, thank you for letting me discuss this topic today and for giving me a chance to really reflect about myself and my background.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was amazing. All three of you, thank you so very much for those presentations. There's so much to unpack and talk about. And I want to kind of start with those threads that kind of weave, between all of your stories. And I think it is the storytelling piece, like Laura was just kind of talking about just now, how graphic novels are used to tell a story in ways that maybe other traditional forms of prose or narrative cannot. So what do you think makes comics and graphic novels more suited to expressing those stories that have the strong cultural resonance versus a novel or a short story or even poetry? I'll start with Leela, and then we'll just go around. What do you think?
That's a really, I think, a question that could be an encyclopedia written about, I notice that I'm very drawn, especially to nonfiction in the graphic novel format, and I see that everything I pick up, there is conflict and there is internal conflict embedded in the story, which of course is what a story has to have. You have to have conflict or there is no story. It's just static. And who more appreciates conflict than a person who is thrown into a new environment or is or somehow comes across the restrictions that society places on them. I think that just that combination of text and pictures puts us inside someone else's life, whether it's a fictional or non-fictional story, that it is kind of a way to be more deeply immersed. And sometimes I find myself having to defend graphic novel. Like people will say to me something like, why did you decide to go with a graphic novel? Why not a traditional text?
Sure. And
I think, hang on a second, before there was writing, there were pictorials.
Right.
This should not necessarily be the default that we go to text. Before we can utter a single word, we are experiencing the world through visual, through what we see, what we hear, and I think it just goes to our deepest being. And therefore, when we're talking about deep things, the way that all of our comics do, and those many comic creators, that is a natural go-to. That's a natural. Graphic novel and comics are composed a natural medium for expressing these things.
Yeah, agreed. And for building, I think, empathy, right, for each other. And you can see in all of the characters of your work, I can see the feeling in the art, so I think people do learn that empathy. Jiva, what do you think? Why do you think that comics and graphic novels are such a powerful way to share your stories?
Yeah, as Leela said, I mean, she hit the nail on the head. The synthesis of image and text is a primal one, right? As was stated before, if we think about it, the written language is somewhat of a modern construct of communicating thoughts and ideas. The original, most primal form of communicating thoughts and ideas is the picture, is the image. We could take it back. One thing that I always talk about with my students, when I actually talk about design and I talk about fonts versus image, I always come up with this story of my imaginary Neanderthal Ukanuk. That's what I call him. And so it's like, at the end of a long hunt, and they get the caribou and they cook the caribou, and the tribe is all good, and they're picking their teeth with sticks or something like that. Ukanuk is, he's thinking about like the meal of the day, he's thinking about the hunt, and he wants to talk about the hunt. So what does he do? He takes that piece of charcoal that's not in the fire, but he takes that piece of charcoal, he takes that ochre, and then he makes a picture, right? And he's talking about the hunt of the day. And throughout the centuries, those pictures became letter forms, right? So they become the letters. The thing about the picture, though, is that the picture is universal. And that's the magic of graphic novels. It's universal. Doesn't matter what language you speak. If you see the picture and you correlate it with the words, you get the story. That's why, for instance, Japanese animation or Japanese manga, which is just a fancy word for, just the Japanese word for comics. That's why manga worked, in the US, because even though people couldn't necessarily read Japanese, they could follow the story.
Right.
Right? And that's the same with all of us and how we discovered comics and how comics became our visual language. So on and so forth. It allows us to get to those primal ideas and to have that be accessible for everybody to read, When people talk about prose or they think about just prose novels because that's the grown-up way to read, it's not necessarily so, right? I mean, it is one way to read. I'm not knocking prose, but the thing that graphic novels can do that prose is hard to do is what Leela said and what is expressed throughout all of us. Is like, it allows us to get that message across, right? There's no confusion when you have the image and the text together, right? This is what we're talking about. And so that's why, you know, I feel that comics and graphic novels is such an important tool for getting those deeper concepts across to the masses.
Right. And sometimes I find myself, I don't know if this happens to anyone else, but like reading, because I'm trained in that, reading the text, focusing so hard on the text in a graphic novel, if I just were to look at the picture, the image, the panel, I would understand it better than I do, you know, but we're trained to read the text.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Laura.
Yeah, adding on to everyone else said, really, like, really did the right, like, answer. But, like, yeah, just adding on, I think just as humans, we're, like, visual creatures. And just with the images and the text together, it's really what lets us get our message across. But it also, at the same time, the reader is also taken on a journey with us, like, because there's that there's like the white space between the panels that suggests like passage of time, and like we can't control how the reader's gonna see the passage of time, but I think it's like a great invitation, like as authors and artists, to create something together with the reader as they're reading it.
Yeah. Yes. It kind of changes it when both are involved, right?
Yeah.
It elevates the meaning. And I think that kind of leads into the next question. As we know, comics they reflect our identities, and then they also mirror to others. And I'm thinking particularly about kind of the intersectionality that I see in all of your work and in really good graphic novels, you know, where, for instance, Leela, I remember a few panels from your memoir of you like literally erasing yourself. It was a piece where you were erasing yourself. You just felt at some moment, whether it was a piece of your gender, age, and, you know, intersecting with, you know, your nationality and language, you just felt an erasure, you know, and I think that Laura, you spoke to that too, and so did Jiba in different ways. Where do you see those intersectionalities happening for you in your work, and how can they also reflect to others, do you think? Leela, or Jiba, why don't you start this one?
Okay, so yeah, identity is extremely, extremely important. What's even more important, I think, is the exploration of self-identity. You know, what we have going on in this country, what we have going on in the world, is that you have a great number of people who have created an identity based on what other people told them their identity should be. The great thing about graphic novels, and as a creator and consciously exploring, you know, exploring my culture, exploring my history, you know, on both ends of the pond, doing these books, especially doing the Horsemen, really gave me an opportunity to explore my history. You know, explore my history through mythology, through the fantastic stories of these different cultures. And then how do I link that with my own personal history? Like my own personal history, especially the Liberian side, has a mythic quality all of its own. I'm very lucky to be born into the family that I am. But that has allowed me to like take all of these things, right? And in crafting, especially the world of the Horsemen, like it gives me the opportunity to craft in a lot of ways my spiritual beliefs, my ethics, you know, it helps me to actually define who I am as a person, as, you know, again, this person of two cultures, this person with one foot on the continent, one foot on the States, and who I am in that space. Because growing up, you know, I had people whose their identities they weren't clear of, right? You know, trying to tell me who I am, like trying to say that, you know, I heard the African booty scratcher thing, you know what I mean, from other African American kids when they found out that my mom was African, right? You know, we even see it today. It's like, well, you know, what kind of Black person are you, right? You know, people trying to define me through their lens, which is very dusty and unclean and unclear. And so with the graphic novels, allowing me to really tap into my culture, really tap into how I fit in that culture, allows me to say to these people who are questioning who I am, it's like, I know exactly who I am. Hopefully through my work, I can give you a glimpse into you understanding who you really are.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's how I approach that intersectionality.
Wonderful. Thank you. Laura, what do you think about that with the intersectionality in your work? How does that manifest itself?
I think it's like just really trying to share the stories that I've come in contact with, and it's such a big topic.
I know, these are big questions. We could go on for hours and hours, right?
Yeah.
Write books on this.
Right.
I think I'm really, right now, what I'm learning is like not to be afraid of putting like all this identity and my culture that I'm learning in my work. Because I think before I would draw, but like try not, like it will be like neutral drawings kind of.
Sure.
So right now I think I'm just really learning and absorbing everything so that I can put myself in my work more fully. Yeah.
Nice. Lila, how about you?
Well, when I think about intersectionality, it feels to me like a new term. It feels like something, at least because I'm not an academic and I'm kind of new in publishing, that it only reached my ears a few years ago. And the way that I see it is that it's a recognition of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we all, we carry multitudes, all of us. You know, we have many shades of self. And so for my memoir, I felt like I had to narrow down the focus and just basically mostly talk about the immigrant experience and talk about our 1960s experience of Alabama and what was going on in the civil rights. Just all the events, one after another that we witnessed or that we were standing close to at that time. But there's a lot that I left out. How to fill out that humanity, that how to make myself, like treat myself almost like a character, and to try to flesh her out. So that's why I included some of the aspects that you referred to that appear toward in the last chapter, where I'm going through adolescence and basically having all these senses of I don't know where I belong. And part of that, yes, is exactly what Laura said, of coming into a new culture, a culture that I know is not fully my own, and yet the one that I came from no longer fits me either. That's something that all of us who have immigrated carry with us. So trying to just sort of fill that in without putting a really strong focus on it is just something I feel that we have to do to give as a memoirist, to give the reader a chance to enter the story somehow. Like if you didn't have these things happen to you, if you are a native of the US and you have no idea what I mean by, having to learn English and all of that, but you still somehow have been an outsider in some kind of way. In some way you have encountered feeling that you don't belong. And so trying to reach the reader there, I feel that intersectionality is a gift that we can give to a reader, a way for them to access our stories.
Yeah.
So.
Wonderful, right. And sort of like Jiba said, like learning about yourself, developing yourself through reading about another, identity or in another person's fluidity of experience, and that is what intersectionality is. I think it's just like, the fluidity, not the fixedness that people give us or put on us completely. Thank you all for answering that. Okay, so I am going to take questions from the audience, though I do have more moderator questions, but I want to make sure that if there are any questions from the audience, that I do receive those, and I currently don't have any in our Q&A. And Sophie, oh, I don't have an earpiece, I'm just kidding. But she is communicating with me, and she said that there's no questions yet on Facebook either. So I do have a couple more moderator questions, if you don't mind. It has a minute, maybe, okay. Thank you very much. So another question is about reimagining some of those that canon of superheroes as people of color. So there's been that trend in mainstream comic creating, which has been traditionally, very marginalizing for certain groups, women, people of color, women of color, as you know. And there's been some trends in remaking some of those iconic superheroes as people of color. People have thoughts about that. I know that not everybody, has opinions on that or whatever, but does anyone have anything they want to say or share about their opinion on that?
Yeah, I could speak on that.
Sure, yeah. I think that makes sense.
yeah, because I'm knee deep. I'm actually nose deep in that whole discussion. So,
yes.
And actually, I was on another podcast and we talked about the same thing. What's interesting about those discussions now, right, is yes, historically, and when I say historically, I say from the beginning of what comic books became in the United States till now. There's always been that marginalization, right? At the same time, there's always been a sense of diversity and a sense of diversity from the groundswell. So, for instance, I am a member of what is called the Black Comics Movement, all right? Where you have many African and African-American creators of color, because this is all over the African diaspora of Black and brown people creating their own comics, creating their own concepts, creating their own heroes. The thing about this movement is that it isn't new. For instance, one of the greatest comics, or what is touted as one of the greatest comics or comic strips of all time, Crazy Cat, was created by an African-American man who was passing for white. You have instances of Black comics, well, way back to all Negro comics in 1940, to artists like Jackie Orms with the Torchy series, artists like Matt Baker, leading up to the 70s, what I'd like to call the proto movement. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, when it really exploded with books like Brother Man, and then later on Milestone Media, which was the imprint from DC, books like Tribe that came out of Image, and on and on and on. So in terms of that, I'm another part of that puzzle. I am like standing on the shoulders of giants. I came out in 2000, right? Or 1999. That's when Grio Enterprises put out its first preview book. And so I feel like the baton was passed on to me. And now in Black comics, like, it's really exploded because of social media. And now, like I said, I have colleagues, I have friends who, are doing books like Bitter Root from Image and Excellence. And then you have the independent works like Crescent City Monsters. And then, stuff like Beautiful Soldiers that's coming out, or Spirit's Destiny. So you have these, African and African-American men and women globally, because I was just talking about the States. I'm not even getting into the books coming out of like Nigeria and South Africa, and so on and so forth. So with that being said, In the independent sphere, you have a lot of diversity. In the mainstream sphere, DC and Marvel, what I like to call the corporate two, they actually had some diverse characters, but now what's happening is that they see how diversity became a buzzword, and it became a buzzword like around 2013, 2015. And so what you see with what I call the corporate two is that you see a very lazy form of inclusion. I like to call it the discoization of inclusion, right? Where like the major record labels, they saw like, oh, this dance music is working. Oh, we get it. Let's just, and then we'll have Rod Stewart doing songs like If You Think I'm Sexy. You know what I mean? Or the Rolling Stones, like, you know, Girl, I Miss You, things like that. You see that with DC and Marvel, right? And so that stuff becomes disingenuous because of the fact that what they're doing is like they're just putting, like you said, they're putting brown face on some existing characters when the majority of the staff, editorial staff, creative staff at these two companies are white and male. And you have, and then you have, again, the tokens, if you will, you know, like you'll have, oh, a woman on this book, you know what I mean? Or look, there's a black person on this book. Oh, look, there's these black characters.
Right.
And one of the things that I've always been doing or always been talking about, it's like, you know, just having another black character or a female character or an LGBTQ character or Latin character, that's all fine and good. What about the LGBTQ or BIPOC editors? What about the creators? What about the writers? What about the artists? What about the people actually telling the story? Because that's where you get true diversity, right? You don't get true diversity just because all of a sudden Thor is a woman, even though I loved Jane Foster as Thor. You know, you don't get that diversity by making Captain America black, although I love Sam Wilson, who was the Falcon, and he became Captain America. I liked that character. You know what I mean? I like that evolution. But true diversity does not come until you have different voices telling different stories. And at the core, I think that is the issue with DC and Marvel, again, as I call the corporate two.
Yeah.
You know, but again, right underneath the surface, you have independent creators like the three panelists right here who will give you what you need if you are truly looking for diversity in voices and truly looking for representations of yourself in comics and graphic novels.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Yeah, it's almost like they missed the whole, that hashtag own voices piece.
What?
Yeah. Okay, so we still don't have any questions from the audience. My final moderator question is, what piece of advice, if any, do you have or would you give to any young creators of color? Laura, can I start with you?
Yeah, so I'm so young myself,
Yeah.
too, so but I think as long as you really look into your own story and basically it's like write what you're familiar with, because that's going to be the most genuine, and what's genuine is really what connects to other readers. And yeah.
Great, I agree. Yes. Yeah.
I agree with what Laura said, that basically coming from your heart, that's
Right.
totally essential. So there's a title of a book that I haven't read, but it appeals to, the idea appeals to me. I think it's, the writer is Cal Newport. So he does like business stuff. And the title of the book is So Good They Can't Ignore You. And so I think that working on your craft, and whatever that means, whatever your type of comic approach appeals to you the most, get into the nuts and bolts of that. And one way of doing that, I think, is to have models, to have model texts, and to deconstruct them, like try to figure out how do they do what they do, stop and analyze how they use the panels and how they marry the text and the visuals, and what is left out, what is unsaid. Just there are a myriad of things that you can do to just basically break it down and try to see, like scene by scene, how this was constructed to understand. There's a ton of work that went behind it there, and that is a huge learning process. But to become as good at every aspect of it as you can possibly be, so that I think more doors are opening now. There is less in publishing. I think you don't encounter as much of, oh, we already have a Latina story. Like we've checked that box, and now we're moving on to our default mode of representing the white stories that we always have. So I think that will hopefully continue to grow, where there is room for not just one Latina story or one Black story, but myriads of them. And but what you got to do is you've got to work on your craft, and that takes time. So don't take a shortcut on that.
It's nice that there are more models for people to use that they can see themselves in, as they're drawing. Shiva, what advice do you have for any young people of color doing comics?
Well, first of all, I love the fact that you started off with Laura to ask that question, because she was perfect about it. Yeah. And then flowing into I'm sorry, I want to make sure I pronounce it correctly. Is it Leela or Lila?
It's Leela.
Leela, okay. Yes. I just want to make sure I pronounce your name correctly, because I get it. But what Laura said was right on the money. What Leela said was right on the money. I'm just going to hop onto it. Number one, I'm going to add a couple of other things to this package as well. Number one, if you are getting into comics because you think right away you're going to sell your comic and make a movie and make $1 million, get into another profession. Flat out, just like any other art form, or just like any other creative enterprise, especially if you make it a career, you're doing it for the love, right? And as a result, people are going to respond to you, especially in comics, if they feel the love coming from your work and emanating out. That's what people respond to. It's really great, especially in this space in 2020, is that there are no boundaries. There are no gatekeepers. If you want to make a comic, you can make a comic. If you want to sell that comic, you can sell that comic, because we have print on demand now, right? You can do it digitally. You can do it print. You can do it both. I do it both, right? I can do it both ways. But the thing is, number one, as Laura said, you have to tell your story, right? You cannot tell a story that you heard from somebody else, because then people are going to just call you a knockoff, of another better story. So you have to find your story. You have to find your voice. You have to figure out what you're bringing to the table, which is different than anybody else. And what you're bringing to the table, honestly, is your identity. Your identity is the thing at the core that drives you to tell the story that you want to tell, right? For instance, with the Horsemen, my identity is that I love mythology. I love mythology. I knew that as a kid, there were African gods and goddesses, so I wanted to show that, right? And through that, then I could say, okay, now I can talk about the things that concern me, right? Like, for instance, I talked about, I had a piece in the book which was a metaphor for the Liberian Civil War that was happening during the time I was writing the book, right? I was able to talk about things like gender roles and how people are, in a quote unquote superhero team, if you will. I was able to write them like the family that they were. You know what I mean? These were the things that I was bringing to the table. And then in addition to that, because I'm a reference nerd and I'm dealing with African culture, and you're dealing with research and stuff like that, I was able to bring in those different things. I was able to bring in, those Pan-African nodes, like not just focusing on the Orishas, like going to other mythologies and Eastern Africa and Western Africa and Southern Africa, and then world mythologies like Babylonian, you know what I mean? Like Chinese, Egyptian, Zoroastrianism, you know what I mean? I could go into those weird places, but again, because I'm exploring who I am and I'm exploring my interests, right? If there's one piece of advice that I could give to young comic book creators, is that if you want to create a unique comic book, don't look at other comic books for inspiration. Look outside the package and figure out which story you want to tell. But with that being said, understand the art of comics, because comics are an art form, and it's a hybrid art form. I would say that comics are one of the purest examples of graphic design I've ever seen. The synthesis of image and text combined to tell a different story, right? So as a young creator, depending on the way that you want to go, for instance, I love your style, Laura. I love your illustration style. And those
Thank you.
Yeah, those are unique to you. It's honest, it's strong, and it also shows that sense of you knowing the basics, like the anatomy, proportions, perspective, things that are important for young artists to know. And also, your work is unique to you. That is unique to how you see the world and how you depict the world. What I see from a lot of creators and young creators is that, again, they mimic somebody else's style and they think that's their own, right? So for the quote unquote anime style, you know what I mean? Like, again, people's work looking like Dragon Ball Z and, and Pokemon, and they're thinking, yeah, this is my original style. And I would tell my students in a very kung fu way is that you have no style. What it is right now is that you are mimicking somebody else's style. And you really, again, haven't found your own identity yet. Don't get me wrong, you can be influenced by other people's work, as all artists are. But at a certain point, you cannot be a slave to your influence. You have to go out and begin to find your own visual voice. So, yeah, I'm in teacher mode right now. So, so that is my long-winded answer.
Yeah, it's great. And I think that it's telling a story, telling your own story in your own way, and learning how to do it at the same time, using models, and doing your research. But always at the end of the day, it's through love, right? I think the answer is that love is what creates cultural connections with comics. And that's how you see it, and it's how you experience it. Okay, so thank you all so much.
You're welcome. I have a quick question.
Sure.
Are you guys seeing like Q&As popping up right now?
I see one question. Are you guys seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's kind of a fun question to end on. And then we'll be done by 11:30. What is the biggest message you hope people get from your work?
Okay, can we start with Lila?
Absolutely.
I never really think about it in terms of, here's my message. I think about it in terms of, here's my story. Now do with it what you will. So I published my book in 2012, and a lot of the things that I wrote about when I started in 2008, and it took me about 3.5 years to complete it. And during that time, I was thinking that I was writing about history, like sort of settled history. And so I think that what a lot of people, what I myself realized once the book was out in March of 2012, a lot of the things that I thought were settled history are not so settled. Like, we are regressing in a number of ways. The very same, my first sort of opportunity to speak to an audience, and I'm talking about Jimmy Lee Jackson, an unarmed young man being shot. It was just within days of Trayvon Martin being shot, and all of that series of shootings of young Black men that came to the attention of the public, you know, shortly after that. It's like the first in a very long and continuous series. So, so maybe, I would say maybe that would be it. That I hope that my readers go like, man, this happened in 1965. Has anything changed? Or has enough changed? Maybe that's the message that I'm thinking of right now as I sit in 2020.
Perfect. Perfect. Laura?
So I think in my art, I'm really just trying to share who I am in my story, but I do want others to like read it, and like they can learn about me, but at the same time, I want them to learn about themselves, and that it's okay to change, like as you're reading different perspectives, and yeah, just to grow themselves as a person too, along with me.
Yeah. Perfect. It's okay to change. It's okay to grow and be different than you were before. You don't have to stay the same person, right? Like,
Yeah.
great. Javon.
Okay. The message that I hope that people get from my work. Well, first of all, I hope they enjoy the story. Okay. Second of all, I hope that in enjoying my story, it makes them want to seek out other stories. Not just my story, but if anything, my message is that I am one of many, and we're out here. And if I am your entry point into reading about other works from other different viewpoints than the ones that you've been fed to, for so many years, then I've done my job.
Great, great. This has been wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming and being here and talking with us at the Aurora Public Library and in Aurora, and to all the people who have been listening, thank you so much. Is there any last comments, anything anybody wants to put out there before we adjourn?
I want to say thank you to you, Krista, to the library, and to Laura and Jibba. It's always fantastic to be on a panel and to meet other creators and to become aware of other expressions besides the one little narrow field where I'm sitting. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Who's next? I'm gonna let Laura go next. So.
Okay, any last words, Laura?
Yeah, just thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad that my city supports me too. And I'm really glad to meet the other artists and having this discussion and being able to really reflect upon myself and all the fears that are kind of holding me back in my art. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure, thank you very much for being here.
Gotcha. I mirror everyone by saying first, thank you very much for the Aurora Public Library and for you, Krista, reaching out to me to ask me to be a part of this panel. I also want to thank my fellow panelists and thank you guys for sharing your work. You know, genuinely, it's beautiful, beautiful stuff. It's beautiful stuff. I am a fan of different voices, and I am a fan, I am a true fan of diversity, because that's what makes this world interesting. So if there are any final words for this panel, is that continue to be interesting and continue to seek out different stories, because you'll find that you learn a lot about yourself when you see the experiences of others.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for that. This has been a great conversation. You guys have a great rest of your day. And again, thanks for being here.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye.